Hi, my name is Kyle Sweet, and I'm the general counsel and co-founder of CCW Safe. And my good friend Gary Eastridge, who is our critical response coordinator for CCW Safe, is here with me. And we're going to have a kind of a conversation about some things that Gary and I do in our professional capacity for myself as a lawyer in my outside of CCW Safe world, which is my private practice law firm, and what Gary does through CCW Safe and his many years of experience investigating homicides. We've created a protocol and a process that we want to kind of explain to people how it not only benefits the things we do for my clients, but the things we benefit for our members of CCW Safe. So Gary, kind of talk a little bit and explain kind of how you and I and others have developed, and then what is the protocol that we use, and kind of how we came up with it, combining my side from the legal world and a little bit of law enforcement experience, and your side from a lot of law enforcement experience, and and living in the legal world on the criminal justice side on the DA's office.
Well, for me personally, it was a pretty easy transition coming from the district attorney's office to CCW Safe, because a lot of the same things that I did in that role apply in the role that I'm in now.
And I should say that one of the things we do is we respond to officer-involved shootings on a call-out schedule for Fraternal Order of Police organizations, and we literally respond in my law firm side as the attorneys for the officer, and Gary is a capacity as a consultant investigator who's working with us as an expert to analyze the situation. So kind of explain to us how we've kind of developed this.
Okay. Well, my background was 22 years with Oklahoma City Police Department. I retired out of the homicide unit. One of my duties and responsibilities there was responding to officer-involved shootings. Immediate response after the first responders, the investigators are called in, and I responded in that role. Then once I went to work for the district attorney's office, it was more of a role of reviewing the actions, reviewing that investigative product that was brought over from the police department to look at the applicable state laws to make sure that all laws were followed and that sort of thing. Well, once I transitioned to CCW Safe, my knowledge and experience with investigating the charging process, if there is charges, the supporting roles that I have seen as an FOP member, all of those things are put together, and then a response is created from that. And our response is, as you've been a part of several times here recently, is, the call goes out, hey, we've had an officer that's involved in a shooting. One of us immediately responds. We look after the officer's needs, which can be vast and in the immediate aftermath of a critical incident.
And one thing important to remember is we in that capacity, as defending the interests and protecting the freedom of the police officer who's just been involved in this shooting, is we don't get access to the scene. We are not conducting a parallel investigation. What we're doing is trying to basically download as much information as we can about what happened, get a sense of the terrain, get a sense of what the experience the officer had from his or her perspective, so we can start building our preparation process so we can begin to prepare that officer. Because unlike most people who are civilians, police officers, through their collective bargaining agreement, have a negotiated waiting period that the internal affairs or the homicide detectives, whoever it is conducting the investigation into the shooting, which will eventually result in a report to the district attorney, whether they can decline to press charges or accept the case and go forward with some type of a criminal prosecution. So it's high stakes. We're talking about the career and the freedom of an individual. So it's something we take it very serious. And one of the things that is important is to be self-aware as a lawyer and stay in my own lane of what my expertise is, and bring in somebody like Gary who's seen it from the perspective of, you've been the guy in the shooting, you've been the guy in the chair when you're being interviewed, you've been the guy sitting across that interview table investigating the officer-involved shooting and asking those questions, and then taking that, compiling and reporting it to the district attorney. Then you've been in the situation where you're the consultant expert an investigator for the DA who's making the determination to whether or not to accept this case and prosecute it or decline charges. Of course, most result in declined charges. But one thing that's critical for us, that I think is a central point in our preparation process of our client, is the fact of who is the audience for this interview. And so a lot of times, Gary, kind of explained to what you've seen officers and civilians as well, the language they use is trying to not impress, but they're trying to sound professional as a police officer to the audience of the two homicide detectives sitting across from them. What do you hear in that situation?
It's fairly common, especially in law enforcement circles. But part of I shouldn't say the role, but part of the traits you pick up as a law enforcement officer is kind of a poker face type demeanor, where you everything's the facts and nothing but the facts, and you unemotional. You can come across as very sterile, and things that can be shocking to the average person you relate in a very almost medical terms,
right.
When each of those roles that I have been involved in, they're all similar, yet they're all unique in the sense that the investigative role is just a fact-finding role. Get everything together, present that to the district attorney. The district attorney role is reviewing all of that and looking to see if there's any violations of state statute or federal laws. And then as the responding consultant for the FOP, or in the case of a CCW Safe member, is making sure that their physical needs or emotional needs are addressed initially, and that their rights are protected, and that they're afforded the same courtesies that a law enforcement officer would get. One of the things that I saw in each of those roles is this kind of effect that we see primarily out of law enforcement officers. They don't want to show emotion, and sometimes what they say can come across as extremely sterile.
Right, and that's one of the things we focus on, because what we do, just to kind of outline what our process works, as Gary said, we respond. A lawyer has to respond to the scene to provide legal counsel and guidance to the client. So what that looks like is a union representative is already there. So that's a difference in a civilian shooting. You have no union representative who's with you at the time. In a law enforcement shooting, you have some resources that you can't have in the civilian world because you don't have a collective bargaining agreement in place, where you have a negotiated response to a certain capacity. The police department has what they call CHAPS units, or chaplain response teams. And so many times, by the time I get there, there's been other people who are in an advocacy role for the officer who are already there. In a civilian shooting, that's not going to happen. So you're going to be, in fact, denied access to those who you care about, who are doing things in your interest for some period of time as a civilian, whereas they don't ask any questions of the officer initially at the time of the scene, other than what we call like public safety type questions. Questions that they can determine how many shooters were there. Are there potential, how many rounds were fired? We need to know how many shots were fired, what your backdrop may have been, loosely, not specifically, but so they can look if there are other people who may be injured. Just basic kind of information to determine what incident happened and how many people are involved and where did they run, that type of thing. So by the time I get there, that process has mostly taken place. The officer is going to be photographed. They're going to have their gun is going to be emptied. They're going to photograph they actually have the plastic trays like that come in the ammunition boxes, and they're going to count all of the rounds, photograph all that, photograph the officer. And so we always want people in a civilian situation. A lot of times they're not necessarily going to, self-defense is not something that's going to be advocated for by the people who are investigating this to determine whether you violated the law. So if you have any scratches, wounds, you may have your adrenaline will initially be going, and you may not feel like you're hurt. Get evaluated medically is one of the things that we've learned from all these processes, is you got to get evidence made for you for your case as soon as possible. And that's going to be evidence of self-defense, a struggle, a wound that you have, the fact that you were struck, you have a red mark, whatever it may be. Your clothes are torn. they may or may not photograph that. So if you do have those things, ask them to photograph them. If they don't have them, get a cell phone image of it, whatever you can do to help preserve that at the time. Meanwhile, I notify Gary when I'm out on the response to this, because what we want to do is create this as a beta test for how we can, create best practices and raise essentially the standards of what our response is going to be for whether they're civilians or whether it's police officers. And then we get the officers settled, we find out everything we can about it, and we don't want to put too much pressure on them that night. We usually meet with them again the next day. We with Gary and I do, and we sometimes will have other people, maybe another investigator, another lawyer in my office, and we get them to slowly walk us through factually everything that happened, and explain what, from your experience, Gary, how that's kind of gone when we've done that.
Well, it's it's a component that is a courtesy that is extended to law enforcement, that it's been recognized that in-depth interviews should not take place until there's two sleep cycles have occurred. Those same processes that we utilize, working through these, so many times we see, just like in the most recent case that we were involved with, as we walk through that process, the involved officer remembers details that he didn't remember during the initial public safety type interview.
Yeah, we have had that. We've had a lot of these recently and over the last few years. One thing that we do is we want to walk them through everything that happened so we can get them used to the concept of telling their story. And we want to focus initially, like we were talking earlier, the words they use. We don't want to use sterile words. And you get them in law enforcement, such as, rather than, I pulled my gun out, I was in fear for my life, and I thought I was going to die or they're going to kill my partner, and I put my finger on the trigger, and when I could not get him to stop, I fired. Okay, that would be like what a normal person would say. But a police officer gets into the, I'm on duty role, and it says, well, I drew my firearm and I accessed the trigger and that type of thing. I discharged my weapon. Well, that's clinical words to describe an incredibly emotional experience. And what we want to convey is not the sterility of your professionalism. We want to convey the emotion of your humanity. And that it's important because, like we talked about, who's the ultimate audience here? The ultimate audience is not your two colleagues who are homicide investigators who you probably know. It's ultimately a jury. Because if that jury is going to be satisfied by your response and they feel they have something in common with you, then the principle I've always tried cases under, if the jury likes you, they like your cause. And what we want to make sure is that we are communicating to the ultimate determiner of the fact of the case, be it a criminal case or be it a civil case. And we want our officer to be likable.
And I think that can also play a role in the decision making on whether or not to charge an officer, or in the case of CCW Safe, a private citizen involved in a self-defense situation. If you consent to an interview too quickly, before things are clear to yourself, let alone, what really occurred, you can come across as clinical. The person who makes that decision on whether that action was criminal or not is, in most jurisdictions, a prosecutor's office. So if they review a product that they've got this cold, sterile guy talking about the mechanics of taking another person's life, sometimes that could be the deciding factor on whether or not a district attorney may well say, hey, this is one for the jury to decide.
Right, and then ultimately they're the trier of fact. And one thing we've learned in this process, it's been so, I think, critically important, and I think Gary does as well, we've talked about it a lot as we've developed it, is in my world of my trial practice defending, physicians and executives and, these large catastrophic type of injury cases, is you cannot take somebody, no matter how smart they are, and put them in a situation they've never been in and expect excellence. You can't do it. What we all have learned is we put them in a situation where it's a controlled environment, where it's safe for them to fail. In other words, our whole thing is leading up to a mock preparation, mock interview. So what we do is once we walk this officer through the facts several times to make sure we got a pretty good command on things, the very next thing we do is we go back to the scene. And we want to see the scene at the same time of day that the officer did. And Gary and I have been in really distressing neighborhoods at all hours of the day and night because we want to see things. So we get back, we drive from the perspective of where the officer came from because we're going to pick up on things as we go that are going to be important to help that officer remember certain things or things that they may not have seen but are be important to the defense of the threat or the communication that they were receiving. So we take the same route the officer did and we look at it from multiple perspectives. We get out at times and walk the area and get a sense of what happened. And we do a sketch of the scene, and that allows us when we go back and do further interviews with the preparation with the officer after that scene walkthrough, on our own without it still being a crime scene, is it allows us to orient ourselves, and so we're better prepared to now begin the mock interview process. And so Gary has been on both sides of the table as the person who's was officer involved in the shooting and the person who's conducting the interview of the officer. So what's really critical is to put them in the safe opportunity for them to fail so we can learn from it. And they do. We all would. And we have to continue to start over, and we make suggestions on better ways to communicate what it was that they just went through. And a lot of times it's important to use, like we talked about, language that a jury would understand, as opposed to, I viewed that the person was a threat and could possibly have been and harmed myself or others, or committed great bodily injury. No, that's not right. The language we want to use is, I was terrified he was going to kill me or my partner, and I couldn't get him to stop, and so I fired. That's the type of thing we want. And Gary basically conducts a mock interview, and we can go over it and over it and over it again until we feel that officer is in a position where that they have the best understanding of what happened.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note that the substance of what's being said doesn't change. It's not that we're telling anyone to say one thing or the other. It's the manner that they say it. It's the wording that is used, that sort of thing.
Yeah, we're not changing a no to a yes.
No, absolutely. Nothing factual has changed. And another thing, this process of doing the scene walkthrough at a later time when the officer, the critical stress has somewhat diminished, is we almost always have revelations of memory when we're doing that. That things that you touched on perspective, when they get there and the stress is not there, the perspective changes and things become a lot clearer. And it makes us able to help the officer give a clearer view of what happened.
And we've seen some of the Maddox case as well, which is a case that, I'd encourage, if you don't know anything about it, I'd encourage you to go back and look. It was a capital murder case that CCW Safe defended last year, and our member was acquitted of a first-degree murder charge. And in that instance, it was a smaller jurisdiction, which could happen at a large one too. I'm not, belittling smaller departments in law enforcement, but this was a poorly resourced small-town police department who did not have a lot of experience investigating homicides. And in that instance, there were a lot of security cameras that captured footage of the events leading up to the shooting, and many of them had never been properly reviewed by law enforcement. So one of the important things to do these days, and when we're on an officer-involved shooting, we have access to data that you may not in a civilian shooting, and that's the body cam footage of officers that's becoming standard of practice for police to wear these. Furthermore, we recently had a shooting that was at a convenience store, and in the nighttime when the shooting occurred around midnight, it was harder to be able to see because of the shadows outside the lights of the very well lit parking lot. We wanted to get a sense of all of the surrounding surveillance cameras. Now that was a very cut and dry shooting. Okay, the officer was cleared within a few weeks, and things went well. But the way we do this is, when I call it beta testing, we're practicing to be excellent all the time. We're not going to hope we rise to the occasion. We're going to make sure that we do all the things. And so we were looking for every potential surveillance camera, security footage, and where they would be, so that if there was litigation that occurred out of this, criminally or civilly, we would be able to ask through discovery to demand production of the security footage. And you can't ask for something you don't know exists, and so you got to go out and affirmatively do that work. So we're in our process now. Gary has finished conducting, multiple run-throughs of a mock interview. The officer goes home, we let him relax. The next day, typically, we view the body cam footage. Some of the departments won't allow our consultant expert investigator to go with us to review the footage. So what we do, the process we've kind of negotiated is that the officer can review all of the body cam footages that are in existence as many times as we want, and then we have a chance to basically conference about it, myself and my client, and then I get Gary on the phone and let him know kind of what we saw, what are some things, if there's any surprises, if there's anything that reinforce something, concerns we may have, and we talk through it, and then at that point we present the officer for the interview. And to this point, we've had comment from a lot of the investigators that they've never seen officers do this well of a job of communicating the information that the district attorney needs to make his or her decision about whether to pursue charges, which is not common, or to just decline to prosecute and recommend that the officer be returned to duty. And obviously, the reason we're trying to make sure that we pay such close attention to honing this process to where we're turning over every rock is at some point we're going to get that case that is not going to be cut and dry. And when we do have that case, we want to make sure that the process we have has not been weakened or dulled by just going through the motions. So we're constantly asking for feedback from our clients as well once they've been through this process. Was there anything that made you uncomfortable about this? Was there anything you felt insecure about? We bounce ideas off of each other, and Gary's brother Kyle is a longtime homicide investigator as well. We'll kind of bounce. We'll call it a hot wash, and we'll try to critique the way we did it and see how we can get this better. And we bring that to that same fine eye to the detail of what we're doing to the response for CCW Safe. And Gary was involved and we had a member involved in a fatal shooting just a couple of weeks ago. And our response kicked in. We've learned from it. We had boots on the ground, a lawyer in place immediately, and we do everything within our power and to throw resources at that member, just like what we're learning on the officer-involved shooting side. So what are some of your kind of final takeaways, Gary, over things that you've learned through this process of basically taking a preparation model for the first time in law enforcement, and based on the experience you had from your shooting many years ago, and what others have been? What are your thoughts on it?
Well, the changes over that many decades from my shooting are vast. Number one, the recognition that memories that are tainted by extreme stress, they need a little bit of a healing process, which is usually accomplished through a couple sleep cycles. And you touched on body camera and body cam footage, that sort of thing, surveillance camera. The civilian shooter is not going to have that ability to request to look at those type things if in fact they exist.
During the investigative
stage, which is where we kick in for our law enforcement clients. I think it's extremely important for us as an advocate for the officer or for a CCW Safe member to be able to provide that prosecuting authority with every perspective possible on these issues. You touched on that response, and I'm a firm believer that if someone is seeking self-defense coverage, that they should research every company out there and reach a decision on who best meets their needs. We are the only company in the industry that sends a response team to assist you after a critical incident. This recent case, that member was also a member of a couple other services. The responses were drastically different.
Some of our competitors took days to return his phone call.
Right, and when they did, they gave them an attorney name and said, "Sorry to hear you were involved, and here's your attorney.
Good luck."
And we had an attorney there with our member within an hour or so from our call, and we had boots on the ground. The only difference between the two responses really is we're responding from a central location to anywhere in the United States with CCW Safe, whereas our law enforcement clients are generally there in the same metro area, and we're able to get somebody with them in hours instead of maybe, 10 hours or 12 hours or whatever the case may be.
One thing that's important too to realize, there are a lot of the decision whether to prosecute a police officer involved in a shooting or the decision to prosecute a civilian is being made by a lot of the same type of information. And so that's why our process involves gathering data, putting it through the algorithm of our collective experiences, and coming up with and improving the process to prepare. And when we have that, we have a witness who adequately communicates this terrible experience that they've had, and to the ultimate trier of fact, which is the jury. So we're going to continue to share this information as we go forward, so we can make sure that members are aware and take advantage of the experiences that we're gathering. So look for more of this type of content through articles, through additional videos, as well as podcasting. And we'd love to hear feedback if you have things you want to specifically ask about the process that we've come up with. And we'd love to do it because we'd love to share it as well, because we want it to be available for everybody. Please go to ccwsafe.com. You can look for additional content and look for more to come. We appreciate your time, and thank you, Gary, for joining me.
Bye-bye.